Good afternoon, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane Pro and HD video blog for the 20th of June 2013. Good afternoon to you. All right, taking a look at Tropical Storm Barry and the rest of the western Atlantic basin here. You see Barry now inland over Mexico. Good thing it made landfall when it did. The banding features, the cloud structure was starting to become much better organized, finally taking advantage of that warm water and a little bit more favorable atmospheric conditions. Then it made landfall, and that'll quickly put an end to Barry's life cycle, not before it dumps quite a bit more rain in the region. Look at a close-up shot of Barry down here. It's small in size, especially the area of the deepest convection or thunderstorm activity. However, that can still dump several inches of rain. Fortunately, in one regard, the terrain in here gets pretty high pretty quickly, and what we call the topography of the region is not favorable for this to just linger. Instead, it'll wring itself out. Unfortunately, that wringing out process means a lot of rainfall over that mountainous terrain, perhaps, and that can lead to flash flooding concerns for the area. Looking at the tropics from a water temperature perspective, I thought I would bring this up again today. We usually look at this once a week, but notice in the tropical Atlantic here, things are nice and warm compared to average. The Gulf of Mexico really warming up compared to average. Then you have sort of this cold pool here just outside of the deep tropics, followed by a very pronounced, fairly cold area of water along the equator in the Pacific. Now this is important because clearly we do not have a warming Pacific through here. No El Nino coming. This is much more of a neutral signal. You've got little areas, little patches of slightly warmer than average temperatures and a background of overall cooler than your long-term average sea surface temperatures, what we call the cold Pacific decadal oscillation. I'm getting into too much detail here. The bottom line, we're still looking at a very active season, it looks like, because the warm water in the tropical Atlantic relative to normal, especially here in the Gulf and parts of the Caribbean, but then really look at this Pacific area and how cool that is compared to normal, but not astonishingly so. It's not overwhelming where we have this very cold La Nina pattern compared to average. This is more of your neutral signal, and it is those years that we tend to have the biggest impacts to land from hurricanes in the Atlantic basin. Looking at a close-up of the Gulf of Mexico, right up here along the north central Gulf, water temperatures in there running almost 3 degrees Celsius above normal, easily 4, maybe 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The entire Gulf of Mexico, though, running at above your average or normal, whatever you want to call it. Scientifically, I guess you want to say average, because what's normal, right? But the average temperature definitely being exceeded by these water temperatures in the Gulf. If something were to get in there and have upper level winds that are favorable, we could have some very strong hurricanes there this season, and that's why I bring it up. This kind of stuff's important now because we are moving into, every day, slightly more active periods of the hurricane season. Yes, it takes time, and we're still a little less than 2 months away from the peak of the hurricane season, but when you see water temperatures like this, you have to at least have a little bit of concern that, I might want to be especially ready this season if I live along the Gulf Coast. And I think Barry is a good example of how something can develop when conditions generally aren't supposed to be favorable. And what I mean by that, and I'll go into more detail on this in a moment, we're not in an active phase of what we call the Madden-Julian oscillation. We had Barry form here from a tropical wave that came all the way across and managed to develop. We do have another tropical wave here. The rest of the Atlantic basin completely empty of any organized widespread convection. We're in the downward phase or the dry phase of the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation. And if we look at the eastern Pacific, we're just now starting to see the signs that maybe that MJO pulse is going to work its way eastward from the western Pacific and the maritime continent region to bring a more favorable period of active weather to this part of the world as we get into July. Now, looking at it on a graphic here, the MJO is basically this period of upward motion that circles the globe from west to east. Sometimes it's what we call incoherent. When it goes inside the circle here, it's barely detectable. How do you detect it? by looking at cloud cover, and I'm going to show you a great example of that in just a moment. But right now the MJO is over here, favoring leaving the maritime continent region, and I'll show you exactly what that means in a moment, heading through the western Pacific, kind of weak in nature, then, at least the Euro especially leading the charge here, maybe a pronounced MJO pulse coming into phase 2, which research shows more strongly favors Atlantic Basin activity than any of the other phases. Right now, with it leaving phase 5 and going into phase 6, the Atlantic Basin is typically shut down. On the opposite side of that, once it gets towards phase 2 here, then things start to really get more interesting as favorable upward motion begins to work its way into the western hemisphere. Now you can see the Madden-Julian oscillation by cloud cover. Over here in the maritime continent region, lots and lots of tropical convection, heavy rainfall underneath that, lots of deep convection everywhere, because the atmosphere way up at the 200 millibar level, around 30,000 feet or so, and higher, is more conducive to allowing the air to rise. And that is going to spread from west to east here across the tropical Pacific, eventually towards the eastern Pacific, where we will start to see activity grow off the coast of Mexico, extending probably 1,000 miles out into the eastern Pacific. That area of yellow right in here, going to take a few days for it to sit there and try to do something, but that favorable MJO pulse coming through the Pacific here, going to take a few days. It won't surprise me if in the next 10 days or so we see 2 developments out here. Don't know exactly where they're going to go. Folks along Mexico should certainly be watching. Then we will begin to watch the western parts of the Atlantic Basin even closer. Here's Barry today. Here's the tropical wave I mentioned. Look at the rest of the Atlantic Basin, completely empty of any significant cloud cover except for the intertropical convergence zone, which is where the trade winds meet, and you get this little convergence area where the air tries to rise. But over a large span, the air is not really allowed to rise right now, and we're in that downward phase of the MJO pulse. Therefore, things really aren't that conducive. I think that's going to change as we get into July. Hopefully, after the 4th of July, I think that's what will happen. But July could be especially busy this year, and we want to make sure you have a heads up about it. Not to be alarming or sensationalist or create hype. It is what it is. The writing's on the wall. We've got some amazing tools these days, folks that watch hurricanes, and part of that is being able to predict and track this MJO pulse and understand when the window of opportunity could open, and that's looking like it'll be sometime in July. It's never a guarantee, but I think you'd rather know, oh yeah, I might need to be looking out for something than have it catch you by surprise. I know I would. All right, well, that's it for today's discussion. Again, I'm Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. Always a privilege to do these videos for you on Hurricane Pro and Hurricane HD, of course, the iPad edition. I'll be back with more for you tomorrow.